What is a Final Fantasy?
What is game? What is Final Fantasy
What
game?
is game? What is fantasy? Is it final? Is it 16?
Well, so yeah, this seems to be kind of a sticky issue within like the community of people who play Final Fantasy games because no one seems to have like this. There's both the sense that like each individual person like knows for themselves what it is, but if you like compare what one person says to another, they don't really seem to match. And Lauren, you had actually clued me into this article by journalist Jason Schreier from Bloomberg. And he includes a quote from a long term Square Enix employee, currently vice president Kitase Yoshinori, although he has it in the anglicized order here. The quote goes, quote, "The only requirement," says Square Enix vice president Yoshinori Kitase, who's been working on the franchise since 1990, and that is an important date, is that each game have crystals, magical objects used to summon gargantuan beasts or control natural phenomena, and chocobos, which I forgot to include in the quote because I apparently didn't copy and paste it correctly. These crystals play important roles in the plot of each game, including Final Fantasy XVI, which depicts them as metaphors for climate change. So the three things we have to have are crystals, chocobos, and summons of like fantastic creatures, which is kind of funny because by that standard, by that extremely simple, straightforward standard, Final Fantasy 1, the original Final Fantasy, is not a Final Fantasy game, nor, interestingly enough, is Final Fantasy 2. And the reason why is because Final Fantasy 1 has neither chocobos nor like summons. The summons, what would become the summons, are enemies that you fight in Final Fantasy 1, but you don't have a means of summoning them and doing cool damage. So the original Final Fantasy is 1/3 of a Final Fantasy game, and Final Fantasy 2 is only 2/3 of a Final Fantasy game. And the reason why I point this out, and also the fact that 1990, which is mentioned in that quote, is an important year, because that's after 1 and 2 came out. So Kitase actually doesn't seem to have remembered, or maybe just wasn't as familiar with what 1 and 2 were in fact like. So it creates this problem where I kind of joked about this on Twitter where like the only conclusion that you can come to is that there is one true Final Fantasy game that satisfies every single criterion people have laid out for it. And that game, Lauren, is Kingdom Hearts.
Kingdom Hearts. So before we dive into that, I actually remember tweeting. No, we were Discording. And I actually remember very much laying into Nicholas that I think Kitase was more talking about the concept, okay, and the world building of Final Fantasy, that while it didn't have chocobos maybe in the game, the concept and the lore of the Final Fantasy genre, the universe, if you will, the FFU. I've just been wanting to say that forever, and I'm so sorry that I said that while you were taking a drink.
Wow.
But like, I think that that's also really critical, particularly because I'm currently in narrative design and like focusing on the more creative side of narrative design, which has been building the lore, building the characters, building the delivery mechanisms, say at the creative level, like not just at the systemic level. And I haven't really like been in charge of like actually hard implementing it, right? I'm kind of transitioning, which is like a really awesome time in my career. But now that I'm looking at it, I'm going, I think Kitase was saying FF1 and FF2 are Final Fantasy games because the pure concept of those are summons, or they had to be summoned to have you fight them, because the concept, the story, right, the fiction, the fantasy was that those were being summoned to control natural phenomenon so that you have to fight them, right? And in other ways, I think what's been really exciting is that also means that chocobos, even if you didn't ride them or you didn't see them, existed in concept art. And that's a really interesting premise, right? And so I'm talking about the quote in this premise sort of way to recognize that as like I too will age and potentially be quoted by someone as mystical as Jason Schreier, I would like to be recognized that years from now, when I'm looking back on my life, that because I think that 1990 is 33 years ago, at this
Yeah, oh,
point,
yeah, yeah. Final
right?
Fantasy is an old ass
It is an
series.
old series that if I ever say the concept of X franchise is this and those games didn't even have that,
Yeah,
please all note that the concept no, but I think like me aside, I think like that's really what brings us now into Kingdom Hearts is
yeah,
that where the hell did Kingdom Hearts come from, right? Like we can go and study that history, but
yeah,
like it has the summons, even if they're like Disney people,
yeah.
and it's got chocobos.
Yes, yes, it does.
Yes, it
And
does.
it's got a lot of Final Fantasy characters.
And it's got a
It's got
lot of
more
Final
Final
Fantasy
Fantasy
characters.
characters than Final Fantasy games have.
And what's interesting is that the one thing that it doesn't hit for me, though, as funny as it is that it doesn't have things that are like controlling natural phenomenon. Like
Yeah,
Kingdom
yeah,
Hearts is all about the metaverse and, or the multiverse is what I should say. Excuse me.
yeah.
It's about the
Multi.
multiverse
Yes.
theory and like not so much about climate change, but I do think Final Fantasy has always been about climate change. So I think more seriously, right, we could probably look at this in forms of a term of like invented traditions of what we believe a franchise, right? And you can look at our other
Yeah,
episodes
yeah,
about
yeah, yeah, yeah.
how franchises are built and structured, how Kingdom Hearts teaches children about the multiverse. Um,
Well, I
you
think
know.
there's a desire to create a kind of, interestingly enough, to create a kind of legend or mythos
Mm-hmm.
around the creation of the series, precisely because the truth, like the historically verified, like the thing that you can find documentary evidence for, is extremely messy and includes things like copyright disputes and all sorts of stuff that people don't want to necessarily like. It's not a fun story. It's a very like corporate capitalist story, and I don't know. That's just not fun.
I don't
but
know. I mean, Final Fantasy VII was a great game.
but it's actually well, okay. Setting that
But
aside for a
setting that
second,
aside for
Lauren.
a second,
I
let's
mean,
get back to the argument at
I think
hand.
I think it's actually important that you brought up the concept of invented tradition, because one of the points that Hobsbawm makes in his book is that people, like especially in nation states, people invent traditions to justify like some long-term ancient tradition for like their ethnicity or their politics or whatever, in a time when all of those things feel like they're being destabilized. So the whole idea is that, and this is really apropos for Final Fantasy, because there is a lot of kind of anxiety, especially now in the sort of this more recent turn towards like action role playing games rather than sort of like the classical turn based like tactical role playing games. There's like the sense that like, okay, well, we need to come up with a justification for why all of these things fit together. And so those myths, those stories, those literally, I mean, to be perfectly honest, fabrications on the part of many of the original developers, that helps cement this idea that like, no, there really is a stable through line for all of this, even though you may feel uneasy about how things seem to keep changing every time we put a new one of these out.
And I really like this. I really like that term. And for those of you who don't know, right, Eric Hosbond is a uh, a historian. And
Yeah,
how would you?
he's a Marxist historian. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a Marxist historian. And I was like, I'm going to use the wrong word here. Nicholas, help me out. But for me, he's always been like a great historian that really talks about. And when I like invented traditions as a word, particularly right growing up in the United States, where there are a lot of cultural traditions that come from a milieu.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
a lot of the times when especially when you're in an immigrant household or a mixed household, you do have the invented traditions. Like we've never celebrated Christmas here, but we're going to celebrate it because apparently that's what we do here. And so everybody has to right now celebrate Christmas,
yeah,
even though it wasn't really, it's almost while he says invented traditions, I also like to think of the terminology from game development as an inherited tradition,
yeah,
right? So there's a lot of like tribal knowledge, right, that goes around in game development studios that have existed, right, for 30 years. And eventually you will end up hiring someone that's like, hey, could you just make sense of all of these documents or all
yeah,
of this like fantasy, right? And I think that what's really, really powerful of that is that you'll constantly be having and hiring new developers to,
yeah,
right, reinvent. And also because in these kind of big blockbuster titles like a Final Fantasy, there is that expectation not only of continuing that tradition,
yeah,
but of reinventing it, right? Of saying, hey, it's all connected because of the Final Fantasy universe,
yeah,
but it's also something that is disconnected because we're allowed to do spin-offs, right? We're allowed
yeah,
to, you know, is capitalist, but to increase our market potential and also meet the demands, right, of expected consumers within that market.